Chapter 2. The Editable Blueprint. Architecture over Essence. Most people speak about the mind as if it were an essence, personality, soul, temperament, who I really am. This language is poetic, but it is mechanically useless. If you want to understand metamorphosis, you must abandon essence and adopt architecture. Architecture explains behavior without mythology. Architecture explains identity without permanence. Architecture allows modification without contradiction. From the outside, humans appear consistent. They have preferences, habits, reactions, relational styles, belief systems. But when observed through architecture rather than essence, these consistencies reveal themselves as structures, not truths. A preference is not a fact of identity. It is a trained reward pathway. A habit is not fate. It is a loop encoded by repetition and dopamine. A reaction is not character. It is a hierarchical override from the limbic system. A belief system is not reality. It is a meaning scaffold assembled from memory. Seen this way, the human is not a personality. The human is a stack of subsystems. Internally, this shift feels strange at first. We are accustomed to thinking, this is just who I am. But when examined closely, who I am dissolves into patterns of attention, emotion, memory, and interpretation, all of which can be reconfigured. Externally, architecture reveals itself through models, not stories. Where essence asks, why am I like this? Architecture asks, which subsystem produces this output? This transition matters because essence creates fatalism. If you believe you are anxious, rigid, impulsive, or avoidant, there is nothing to modify. You can only cope. Architecture creates agency. If you understand that anxiety emerges from prediction circuits, rigidity from threat mapping, impulsiveness from dopamine timing, and avoidance from identity boundaries, then the entire system becomes trainable. Architecture also removes moral judgment. Suboptimal behavior is not a flaw. It is a configuration. A configuration can be strengthened, weakened, replaced, rerouted. This is why metamorphosis is real, because architecture is editable. From this sequence forward, when we speak of the self, we are speaking about an architectural stack, not an essence. The sensory layer, the emotional layer, the memory layer, the cognitive layer, the identity layer, the meaning layer. These are not metaphors, they are functional domains. Chapter 2 will show how each domain can be observed, stressed, trained, and rewritten. What essence claims as destiny, architecture reveals as design. Plasticity over permanence. If biology had no plasticity, this chapter would not exist. There would be no architecture to modify, no system to retrain, no blueprint to upgrade. Permanence would rule everything, and metamorphosis would be mythology rather than engineering. The reason metamorphosis is real is that the nervous system is built on plasticity rather than permanence. Plasticity means the system adapts to what it faces. The brain rewires to preserve function, to increase efficiency, or to reduce energetic cost. It adds synaptic density when the environment rewards depth, and removes synaptic density when the environment rewards speed. It strengthens pathways that are frequently used and prunes pathways that are neglected. It adjusts thresholds, timings, and hierarchies to match whatever reality demands. This is not symbolism, it is cellular economy. Most people misunderstand plasticity because they imagine it as a childhood phenomenon. They think the brain becomes fixed after adolescence, as if adulthood marks the end of architectural change. The truth is more precise. The brain never stops reorganizing. It only changes the rules under which reorganization occurs. Childhood plasticity is fast and unregulated, driven by raw sensory input. Adult plasticity is slower and more selective, driven by attention, relevance, and load. It is not weaker, it is more strategic. Plasticity also creates the illusion of personality stability. If a person lives inside the same context, faces the same patterns, and repeats the same loops, the architecture will not be challenged, and therefore will not change. Stability is not permanence, it is lack of demand. When context shifts, patterns shift. When load increases, thresholds shift. When relevance changes, memory reorganizes. Underneath biography, there is machinery adjusting itself continuously. This matters because permanence kills agency. If you believe your emotional reactivity, attention span, memory depth, or relational style are fixed traits, you will only manage them rather than reconfigure them. Plasticity restores agency by demonstrating that behavior is not destiny. It is adaptation. The nervous system is not a sculpture. It is a living topology that changes according to what it encounters and what it repeats. Plasticity is the biological basis of metamorphosis. Without it, the concept of transformation would belong to poetry. With it, metamorphosis belongs to architecture. Hierarchy over chaos. Plasticity does not mean randomness. If the nervous system adapted without order, behavior would collapse into noise and survival would be impossible. The reason plasticity produces coherent change rather than chaos is that the nervous system is structured around hierarchy. Hierarchy organizes the flow of information from lower domains to higher ones. Sensory input arrives first, raw and unfiltered. Emotional and autonomic circuits evaluate it for threat, relevance, and urgency. Cognitive circuits interpret and categorize. Identity circuits decide what it means for me. Meaning circuits determine how it fits into the larger story of reality. The sequence always follows this direction unless damage, trauma, or overload disrupts the hierarchy. This hierarchy explains behaviors that seem irrational from the outside. When emotional circuits override cognitive circuits, logic becomes inaccessible, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the hierarchy has changed priority. When attention collapses under threat, it does so because survival architecture always precedes abstract reasoning. The system does not malfunction. It follows biological order. Hierarchy also prevents the nervous system from wasting energy. Not all input deserves the full stack of processing. Most sensory data is discarded at the lowest layers. Only what is important, relevant, or novel moves upward. This is efficiency, not ignorance. Without hierarchical filtering, consciousness would drown in unstructured input. The hierarchy is not static. It shifts depending on context, developmental history, training, and stress. A person raised in unpredictable environments may develop an architecture where emotional circuits dominate, because prediction requires rapid threat evaluation. A person trained in slow, structured environments may develop strong cognitive integration, because the architecture rewards deliberation. These differences are not personality traits. They are hierarchical configurations shaped by experience. Understanding hierarchy restores clarity to behavior. It shows why intelligence does not guarantee emotional regulation, why memory can be accurate, but interpretation distorted, and why identity can feel disconnected from action. The layers are present, but their order and strength differ between individuals. Hierarchy matters because metamorphosis does not target the entire system at once. It targets which layer controls the system. Changing hierarchy changes behavior more profoundly than changing the content within a single layer. The blueprint is editable, but it is edited through the hierarchy. Integration over isolation. Plasticity and hierarchy describe how the system can change and how it is ordered, but neither of them guarantees that the system behaves as one mind. For metamorphosis to be possible, the subsystems of the nervous system must be able to cooperate. That cooperation has a name: integration. Without integration, a human does not experience a life. They experience fragments. Internally, fragmentation feels like contradiction. A part of you knows something is true. Another part cannot feel it. A part of you wants to act. Another part cannot move. A part of you decides. Another part quietly sabotages the decision. From the outside, fragmentation looks like inconsistency, self-sabotage, or mixed signals. The person says they want one thing and repeatedly does another. They change direction, break promises to themselves, or oscillate between extremes. This is not a moral failure. It is architectural isolation. The brain is built as networks that constantly exchange signals. Sensory circuits influence emotion. Emotion influences thought. Thought influences identity. Identity influences meaning, and meaning feeds back into perception. When these flows are intact, the person experiences themselves as a single agent moving through time. When these flows are blocked, they experience themselves as a collection of parts that cannot agree. Integration is not about feeling balanced or aligned. Those are emotional interpretations. Integration is structural. It answers a simpler question. Can information move from one layer to another without being distorted or silenced? If emotional signals cannot reach cognition, the person thinks clearly but feels nothing. They can describe their pain but cannot inhabit it. If cognition cannot reach identity, the person understands intellectually that change is possible, but still believes, this is just who I am. If memory cannot reach meaning, experiences never consolidate into wisdom. They remain isolated episodes that repeat without teaching. From the inside, lack of integration often hides behind familiar patterns. Numbness, overthinking, compulsive action, chronic indecision, spiritual bypassing, or endless self-analysis without behavioral shift. These are not personality traits. They are coping strategies for an architecture that does not communicate with itself. From the outside, integration can be misread as stability or maturity. But true integration is more subtle. An integrated mind still feels fear, anger, doubt, desire, and grief. The difference is that these signals can travel. They reach the layers that can interpret them, contextualize them, and transform them into action instead of noise. Integration is dynamic. Under safe, moderate load, the system can afford to integrate more channels. It pulls in sensory nuance, emotional tone, past experience, and abstract reasoning. Under overwhelming load, integration collapses because the system chooses survival over completeness. This is why trauma compresses perception. The organism narrows its channels to stay alive, and in doing so, sacrifices connection between layers. Metamorphosis requires increasing integration under higher load. It does not mean you never fragment. It means that, over time, you can stay connected to more of yourself in more difficult conditions. Practices that seem very different on the surface, deep conversation, therapy, contemplation, journaling, certain forms of meditation, high-level learning, even intense artistic practice, share one function. They give signals time and space to move between layers. They let sensation become emotion, emotion become thought, thought become identity, identity become meaning, and meaning feed back into behavior. Integration turns experiences into architecture instead of leaving them as random impacts. Without integration, plasticity rewires blindly. With integration, plasticity rewires intelligently. In the next sequence, we will narrow our focus to the first gate of integration, attention, the mechanism that decides which fragments of reality are even allowed to attempt connection. Attention as gate and filter. Integration cannot even begin if nothing reaches the architecture. The system can only transform what it actually encounters. This is why attention is not a minor cognitive feature. It is the entry point of metamorphosis. Attention decides which fragments of reality are allowed to become architecture. From the inside, attention feels like what I care about right now. From the outside, it looks like focus, distraction, curiosity, or apathy. Mechanically, it is a control system that opens and closes access to the deeper layers. Attention acts as both gate and filter. As a gate, it answers a binary question. Does this signal get in or not? A sound in the distance, a message notification, a memory fragment, a physical sensation. Each competes for access. If the gate does not open, the signal never reaches conscious processing. It does not become something you missed. It becomes something that never existed inside your architecture. As a filter, attention determines how much resolution an incoming signal receives. You can glance at a face and register person, or you can study micro-expressions, tension in the jaw, the way the eyes move. You can hear a sentence and register approval or rejection, or you can notice tone, timing, and what was not said. Depth is not in the world. Depth is in the allocation of attention. Most people treat attention as a moral issue. If they cannot focus, they feel weak or undisciplined. If they become obsessed, they feel guilty or irrational. In reality, attention follows learned rules. It is pulled toward what was dangerous, what was rewarding, or what was unresolved in the past. A nervous system trained in chaos will attend to threat. A nervous system trained in scarcity will attend to opportunity and loss. A nervous system trained in constant stimulation will attend to novelty and struggle to remain with anything that does not spike dopamine. Externally, this produces recognizable patterns. One person cannot stop scanning for criticism. Another cannot stop chasing validation. Another drifts endlessly, unable to hold any object of focus long enough to encode it. Their stories differ. The underlying mechanism is the same. Attention was trained by past architecture, and now it is reinforcing it. For metamorphosis, this is both a problem and an opportunity. The problem. If attention is captured by the same triggers, the same content will keep entering the system, and plasticity will faithfully reinforce the old blueprint. The person will work on themselves while feeding their architecture the same diet. The opportunity. Attention itself is trainable. When you deliberately choose what to study, what to return to, what to stay with beyond the point of boredom, you are rewriting the rules of the gate and the filter. You are teaching the nervous system that certain signals deserve more bandwidth and others less. From the inside, this does not feel heroic. It often feels slow, almost trivial. Staying with a concept a little longer, observing a reaction before acting, listening fully to one sentence instead of half of 10. But these microscopic reallocations of attention are what allow new information to reach the deeper layers where identity and meaning live. Attention decides what is allowed to exist inside you. Metamorphosis begins when attention stops being only a reflex and becomes an instrument. In the next sequence, we will examine emotion not as an enemy of attention, but as one of its most powerful guides, if the architecture is trained to listen rather than obey. Scaffolding as cognitive infrastructure. Memory quality is determined by the structure that supports it, not by the volume of information a person consumes. In cognitive science, this supporting structure is called scaffolding. Scaffolding refers to the invisible network of context, meaning, sequence, relevance, and hierarchy that allows information to anchor itself inside the mind. Without scaffolding, even large amounts of studying result in low recall precision and shallow understanding. With scaffolding, relatively small inputs produce strong retention and durable retrieval. Externally, scaffolding looks like a simple organizational strategy, but internally, it influences the brain's method for binding information together. The brain does not encode based on chronological order. It encodes based on relational significance. When a new concept enters the mind, the first question is not what it is, but where it fits. If no fit is detected, the brain tags the information as low-priority noise and allows it to decay. If a fit is detected, the system begins linking the new input to an existing network of representations. The more connections formed, the more powerful the recall becomes. This is why isolated facts without context are difficult to remember, while connected facts become intuitive. From an internal perspective, the experience of learning changes drastically once scaffolding exists. Without it, learning feels like holding water in open hands. The moment attention shifts, the information slips away. With it, learning feels like adding components to a machine. Every new piece clicks into something already established. There is a subtle sense of completion and internal stability each time a connection is made. This is the beginning of cognitive architecture, not just memory. Many people believe that repetition alone produces learning. Repetition produces familiarity, not structure. Familiarity fades quickly under stress or distraction. Structure persists. This distinction explains why some individuals can reconstruct complex concepts even after forgetting specific details. Their brain stored the architecture, not just the content. With the architecture intact, the content can be reconstructed or relearned quickly, because the original structure already exists. Externally, scaffolding can be engineered intentionally. This means shaping the sequence in which knowledge is acquired so that each new layer attaches to a stable foundation. Internally, the nervous system adapts to this pattern by optimizing for relational meaning rather than raw input density. Over time, the mind becomes more efficient at detecting where new information belongs. This reduces cognitive load, accelerates encoding, and produces a calm form of confidence during learning situations. Confidence in this context is not emotional. It is architectural clarity. When scaffolding is absent, learning environments produce cognitive fragmentation. Fragmentation appears as partial recall, incomplete reasoning, and brittle understanding that collapses under complexity. A fragmented learner performs well only in familiar scenarios. When the environment shifts or demands novel synthesis, performance degrades sharply. This is not a matter of intelligence. It is a structural failure. The hybrid perspective becomes clearer when examining recall. Internally, recall feels like navigation. The learner searches for a pathway to the desired memory. If scaffolding exists, the path is short and direct. If it does not, internal navigation becomes chaotic. The mind jumps between fragments, attempting to construct meaning retroactively. This is inefficient and exhausting. In engineered cognitive systems, the goal is to reverse this pattern. Instead of forcing the brain to work harder, the environment is designed to work with the brain's encoding mechanisms. This means presenting information in a sequence that naturally produces scaffolding. Once this method is applied, a transformation occurs. Learning becomes predictable. Recall becomes reliable. Creativity emerges from integration rather than improvisation. And the mind shifts from reactive consumption to active construction. Synthesis and the construction of cognitive hierarchy. The transition from raw encoding to meaningful cognition does not happen automatically. Encoding paths provide access to memory, but they do not provide structure for thought. Structure emerges through synthesis. Synthesis is the cognitive act of combining encoded elements into hierarchies that support reasoning, prediction, and creativity. Without synthesis, memory remains inert. With synthesis, memory becomes architecture. Externally, synthesis appears as higher-order organization. Concepts are grouped, relationships are mapped, and patterns are detected across different domains. Internally, synthesis manifests as a subtle sense of compression. Large amounts of information begin to occupy less cognitive space. The mind holds more by representing it in fewer units. This compression is a key property of expert cognition. A novice stores information as fragments. An expert stores information as unified structures. This explains why expertise cannot be measured by memory volume alone. It is measured by the density and flexibility of the cognitive hierarchies built through synthesis. These hierarchies permit rapid retrieval, efficient reasoning, and situational adaptability. Without hierarchy, recall may still occur, but reasoning collapses under complexity. The individual knows facts, but cannot use them. Internally, the experience of synthesis is often felt as clarity rather than intensity. It does not feel dramatic. It feels ordered. Concepts align, contradictions resolve, and previously confusing inputs become coherent. The mind experiences reduction in cognitive friction. This reduction is not the result of reduced information. It is the result of more efficient structure. The external mechanism for synthesis involves three architectural operations: merging, mapping, and abstraction. Merging unites related concepts under a shared framework. Mapping identifies relationships between frameworks. Abstraction compresses multiple frameworks into a higher-level representation. These operations are universal across disciplines. A mathematician merges techniques into schemas, maps schemas across problem types, and abstracts them into general strategies. A musician merges harmonic patterns, maps them across genres, and abstracts them into composition principles. An engineer merges components into subsystems, maps subsystems into systems, and abstracts systems into design patterns. The domains differ, but the cognitive architecture is identical. Internally, these operations are not verbal, they are structural. The brain does not announce synthesis, it reorganizes itself. This reorganization often becomes visible only when the individual encounters novel situations. A person who is synthesized can adapt by recombining internal structures. A person who is not synthesized relies on memorized procedures and fails under novelty. This distinction is the foundation of cognitive hierarchy. Cognitive hierarchy itself refers to the arrangement of concepts in layered representations that allow reasoning across scales. The lowest layer contains raw inputs. The middle layers contain patterns. The upper layers contain principles. The top layer contains models. A model is not a memory. It is a structure that can generate predictions. When the mind possesses models, it no longer needs to memorize everything. It simulates. Externally, the presence of hierarchy is observed through behavior. The individual navigates complexity with apparent simplicity. Internally, the presence of hierarchy feels like reduced cognitive effort, despite increased cognitive capacity. This is the hallmark of mature synthesis. When hierarchy is absent, complexity feels overwhelming. When hierarchy is present, complexity feels navigable. This distinction explains why some learning environments produce intelligent improvisation, while others produce brittle performance. Environments oriented around memorization produce surface-level competence that collapses when conditions shift. Environments oriented around synthesis produce deep competence that adapts under pressure. Many educational and professional systems reward the former while claiming to value the latter. The result is a cognitive mismatch. Internally, the shift from encoding to synthesis begins when the learner stops asking what and starts asking why. Why does this belong here? Why does this connect to that? Why does this pattern repeat? These questions initiate mapping and merging. Later, abstraction emerges. Abstraction is not the act of making something vague. It is the act of compressing multiple concrete instances into a single structure that retains predictive power. This is the definition used in mathematics and engineering, and it applies equally to cognition. Synthesis also expands the encoding environment. Once hierarchy exists, new information does not enter as noise. The mind scans for where it fits within the existing architecture. This reduces cognitive load dramatically. A novice must encode each fact individually. An expert integrates new information into a system. The difference in performance compounds over time. Internally, this compounding effect is experienced as acceleration. Learning speeds up, recall stabilizes, and creativity emerges because the mind can recombine structured units. Externally, acceleration manifests as achievement that appears disproportionate to time invested. This is not talent, it is architecture. In engineered cognitive systems, the goal is to create conditions in which synthesis becomes inevitable. Encoding paths provide the raw material. Synthesis constructs the hierarchy. Hierarchy generates models. Models enable simulation. And simulation is the root of adaptive intelligence. When individuals reach this level, learning no longer feels like accumulation. It feels like construction of an internal world capable of navigating the external one. Cross-domain integration and adaptive reasoning. Cross-domain integration is the cognitive phase in which internal models begin interacting across different areas of knowledge. At this stage, memory and synthesis evolve from isolated structures into an adaptable network. The significance of this is often underestimated. Integration is not simply knowing multiple things. It is the ability to let concepts modify one another. This modification produces reasoning that is more powerful than the sum of its components. Externally, integration looks like the ability to apply principles from one field to solve problems in another. Internally, integration feels like transfer. Transfer is the sensation that a concept learned in one context suddenly becomes usable in a completely different context. This is one of the clearest signatures of mature cognitive architecture. Transfer cannot occur without synthesis, and synthesis cannot occur without proper encoding. These phases are not optional, they are sequential. Integration relies on the existence of models. A model compresses experience into a functional structure. When two models intersect, a new structure is formed at the overlap. This overlap produces insight. Insight is not magic. It is the result of cross-domain integration. When an individual experiences sudden clarity, what they are experiencing is the activation of latent overlap between models. The phenomenon feels sudden, but the architecture that produced it has been developing for a long time. Internally, this process is subtle. The learner may not realize integration is occurring until a problem demands it. When exposed to novelty, the mind tests whether existing models can handle the new scenario. If they can, performance appears effortless. If they cannot, cognitive stress occurs. Cognitive stress is a signal that the architecture is incomplete. At this point, the mind either expands its models or reverts to memorized procedures. The former results in growth. The latter results in stagnation. Externally, individuals who possess integration appear adaptive. They navigate unfamiliar conditions without direct instruction. This is often mistaken for talent. In reality, it is architectural. The integrated mind reorganizes information rapidly because its models are general rather than narrow. A narrow model can only operate in the context in which it was learned. A general model can operate across contexts. The difference between the two determines whether learning compounds or collapses. Cross-domain integration also introduces hierarchical reasoning. Hierarchical reasoning is the ability to move vertically between levels of abstraction. The individual can operate at the level of details when required, or move upward to principles when the situation demands generality. This vertical mobility is essential for solving complex problems. Without it, reasoning becomes either too shallow or too rigid. The vertically mobile mind adjusts scale as conditions change. Internally, hierarchical reasoning feels like perspective shifting. When confronted with a problem, the mind checks whether the difficulty lies in missing details or missing structure. If the difficulty is structural, the mind moves upward to locate a principle. If the difficulty is granular, the mind moves downward to examine specifics. This selective shifting optimizes cognitive load and reduces wasted effort. The process requires neither intuition nor inspiration. It requires architecture. Integration produces a second form of reasoning, known as analogical reasoning. Analogical reasoning is the ability to recognize structural similarity between different domains. When the mind detects similar patterns in different contexts, it transfers solutions across boundaries. This mechanism underlies creativity, innovation, and technological progress. It is also a direct result of cognitive architecture. Without abstraction and synthesis, analogy is impossible. Externally, analogical reasoning can be observed in fields such as engineering, music, mathematics, and strategy. Engineers borrow patterns from biological systems. Musicians borrow compositional structures across genres. Mathematicians borrow proofs across domains. Strategists borrow models from ecology to analyze markets. In each case, the mind recognizes that structural similarity is more important than surface difference. This recognition is the basis of analogical power. Internally, analogical reasoning produces a sense of elegance. Solutions feel efficient, not because they are simple, but because they reuse existing structure. Elegance is a cognitive signature. It indicates that the mind is operating at the architectural level rather than at the procedural level. Procedural thinking requires step-by-step instruction. Architectural thinking requires internal models. One scales, the other does not. Integration also influences memory retrieval. When information is integrated across domains, multiple encoding paths lead to the same concept. Retrieval becomes robust because the brain has redundant access routes. This is the opposite of brittle memorization. Brittle memory breaks under stress. Integrated memory holds under stress because it is supported by architecture rather than surface familiarity. Internally, this robustness is experienced as calm. The individual does not panic when recalling complex information. The structure is there. Externally, robustness appears as clarity under pressure. High-performing individuals in demanding fields often display calm, not because of emotional control, but because their cognitive architecture is strong. Their memory does not collapse when stakes are high. It becomes more precise. The final consequence of cross-domain integration is the emergence of adaptive reasoning. Adaptive reasoning is the capacity to modify internal models in response to new conditions. Rather than discarding old models when they fail, the mind refines them. Over time, this produces increasing generality. The architecture becomes capable of predicting more with less. This is the cognitive signature of mastery. Mastery is not defined by knowledge volume. It is defined by architecture. A novice collects facts. An intermediate collects procedures. An advanced learner collects models. A master integrates models across domains. This spectrum exists in every discipline. The question is not how much a person knows, but how their knowledge is structured. Structure determines performance. Performance determines adaptation, and adaptation determines whether learning ends or continues. Internal simulation and predictive cognition. Once cognitive hierarchy is established and models begin interacting across domains, a critical transition occurs. The mind stops relying solely on external inputs and begins generating internal simulations. Simulation is the capacity to model possible outcomes without direct experience. It is the mechanism that allows the mind to navigate future scenarios, test strategies, and refine understanding without real consequences. In cognitive science, this is known as predictive cognition. Externally, simulation can be observed in planning, forecasting, rehearsal, and scenario testing. Internally, simulation feels like visualization, but it is not merely visual. Simulation engages conceptual, emotional, and spatial dimensions simultaneously. A person simulating a conversation does not simply imagine images. They model expectations, responses, and outcomes. A musician simulating a performance models timing, dynamics, and error correction. An engineer simulating a design models constraints, failure points, and optimization strategies. These simulations occur within internal architecture that has been built through encoding, synthesis, and integration. The emergence of simulation marks a shift from reactive cognition to proactive cognition. Reactive cognition responds to events after they occur. Proactive cognition prepares for events before they occur. This shift fundamentally alters how a person learns, adapts, and performs. When simulation is active, the external world is no longer the primary teacher. The internal world becomes a training environment. Mistakes can be made without cost. Strategies can be evaluated without failure. Knowledge can be tested without risk. Internally, simulation relies on predictive models. A predictive model is a structure that represents not just what is, but what could be. For example, a chess player does not memorize moves. They simulate future positions. A scientist does not memorize outcomes. They simulate experiments. A strategist does not memorize instructions. They simulate adversaries. These capacities depend on internal models that can generate possible states and evaluate them. When a model cannot simulate, the mind defaults to memorized procedures. This produces brittle performance under uncertainty. The experience of simulation is often mistaken for imagination. Imagination is the generation of novel constructs. Simulation is the projection of structured models into possible futures. Imagination can operate without accuracy. Simulation cannot. Simulation demands alignment between internal models and external reality. When alignment is strong, predictions are reliable. When alignment is weak, predictions collapse. This collapse produces cognitive dissonance, a signal that the internal architecture needs refinement. Externally, predictive cognition is visible in fields that require anticipation. Pilots, surgeons, traders, and athletes all engage in simulation during high-stakes performance. Their responses appear instantaneous because the computation has already occurred internally. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is pre-computation. The architecture is doing the work before the environment demands it. Predictive cognition also changes memory retrieval. When memories are organized into models, recall is not about retrieving a stored unit. It is about reconstructing a scenario. This reconstruction is efficient because models compress information. Instead of recalling every detail, the mind reconstructs detail from structure. This property allows individuals with strong predictive models to learn faster and forget slower. Forgetting does not destroy capability because capability resides in the model, not the memorized content. Internally, predictive cognition introduces a sense of temporal extension. The mind begins operating across multiple time horizons at once. Short-term actions are evaluated in the context of long-term outcomes. This reorients attention, decision-making, and risk assessment. Short-term gratification becomes less compelling because the architecture is aware of delayed consequences. This shift is cognitive before it becomes behavioral. Behavior follows architecture, not the reverse. Externally, temporal extension appears as strategic patience. Individuals with predictive cognition do not merely react to immediate conditions. They position themselves for future conditions. To an outside observer, this may appear as prudence, foresight, or discipline. Internally, it is none of these. It is simply modeling. The individual does not resist temptation. They simulate outcomes. The simulation reveals costs and benefits. The decision becomes logical rather than emotional. The final consequence of simulation is self-modification. When a system can simulate, it can evaluate its own models. It can detect where predictions fail and modify the underlying architecture. This feedback loop leads to continual improvement without external instruction. A mind that can modify its own models becomes self-educating. This capability is rare, not because it is inaccessible, but because most environments do not cultivate the architecture required to support it. At the highest level, predictive cognition collapses the distinction between learning, performance, and adaptation. Learning becomes model construction. Performance becomes model execution. Adaptation becomes model refinement. The external world provides feedback, but the internal world provides computation. The individual becomes architect rather than consumer. This is the cognitive foundation of autonomy. Autonomy is not independence from others. It is independence from reactive cognition. A reactive mind depends on the environment to dictate its next state. A predictive mind derives its next state from internal simulation. This distinction determines whether a person is shaped by the world or shapes their trajectory through it. In engineered cognitive systems, this capacity is the threshold at which intelligence becomes adaptive and architecture becomes strategic. Resilience under uncertainty. Predictive cognition reveals its true quality only under uncertainty. When conditions are stable and familiar, even weak architectures can appear competent. They rely on rehearsed responses, narrow models, and surface familiarity. The difference between fragile and resilient cognition emerges when events deviate from expectation. At that point, memory volume, apparent intelligence, and verbal fluency stop being reliable indicators. What matters is how the internal architecture behaves when its predictions fail. From an internal perspective, this boundary moment is uncomfortable. The mind encounters an outcome that does not match its simulation. The first impulse is often to defend the existing model, to reinterpret the event so that it fits prior expectation. This defensive reconstruction preserves comfort, but blocks learning. A resilient architecture does the opposite. It treats mismatch as information. The error is not a threat to identity. It is a diagnostic signal. Externally, this distinction can be seen in how people respond to being wrong. Fragile cognition doubles down, rationalizes, or withdraws. Resilient cognition inquires, adjusts, and refines. The observable behavior is only the surface. Underneath, two different processes are operating. One is protecting a rigid model from contradiction. The other is testing a flexible model against reality. Over time, the flexible system becomes more accurate, while the rigid system becomes more detached from the environment it is trying to navigate. Internally, model failure can feel like disorientation. The usual pathways no longer produce reliable predictions. For many, this disorientation triggers avoidance. Attention shifts away from the contradiction and seeks more predictable input. This move restores psychological comfort, but it freezes cognitive architecture at its current level. In contrast, a resilient system allows disorientation to fully register. It holds attention on the boundary until a new or expanded model can be constructed. This is not an emotional trait. It is an architectural capacity for staying with unresolved data. Resilience at the architectural level depends on how models are encoded. Narrow models that are optimized for one specific context tend to shatter under change. General models that are built around deeper structure tend to bend and expand. For example, a person whose understanding of communication is based on memorized phrases will break down when a conversation leaves the rehearsed script. Someone whose understanding is based on principles of turn-taking, intention, and feedback can adapt even when content, setting, and participants change completely. Externally, resilience is often misinterpreted as confidence. In practice, it is structural redundancy. When one predictive path fails, others remain available. The mind does not collapse because its architecture does not depend on a single channel. This redundancy is created earlier in the process, through diverse encoding paths, rich synthesis, and cross-domain integration. By the time uncertainty arrives, the system already has multiple ways to reframe and respond. What looks like calm under pressure is the visible result of invisible scaffolding. Internally, resilient architecture expresses itself as a specific kind of curiosity. The system wants to know why the prediction failed. It traces the path from assumption to outcome, not to assign blame, but to adjust structure. This adjustment can occur at different layers. Sometimes the error reveals a missing detail. Sometimes it reveals a flawed pattern. Sometimes it exposes a broken model. In all cases, the system uses failure as an input to refinement, rather than as a justification for withdrawal. In engineered cognitive systems, this refinement process can be made explicit. After a mismatch, The individual reviews the simulation, identifies where the model diverged from reality, and updates the architecture accordingly. Over time, this creates a feedback loop in which each failure increases predictive precision. The key is that the loop is structural, not emotional. The system is not asking whether it is good or bad. It is asking whether the model is accurate or incomplete. Externally, the long-term effect of architectural resilience is visible in trajectories. People with rigid models often peak early and decline when conditions shift. Their strategies no longer fit, but they cannot update their internal structure. Those with resilient models tend to grow through volatility. They may experience short-term setbacks, but each disruption adds to their architecture. The result is a form of compound cognition. Capacity increases not only with exposure, but with the number of times the system has been forced to rebuild itself. Internally, this compounding process changes the subjective experience of uncertainty. Uncertainty stops being purely threatening. It becomes informative. The system has learned through repeated cycles that mismatch leads to improvement. This does not eliminate discomfort, but it overlays discomfort with a parallel signal. There is something valuable here. At this stage, resilient architecture no longer seeks only stability. It seeks complexity, because complexity provides the data required for further refinement. At the level of superhuman mind architecture, resilience under uncertainty is not optional. It is the main test. Encoding, synthesis, integration, and simulation build the structure. Uncertainty evaluates it. The systems that survive and improve are those that can let their models break without collapsing their identity. In such a mind, being wrong is not a threat, it is a mechanism. The architecture understands that every failed prediction is an opportunity to become more precise, more general, and more adaptive than before. Convergence and architectural closure. When cognitive architecture reaches the stage of convergence, the components that were previously treated as separate functions begin operating as a unified system. Encoding no longer behaves as a passive record of events. It becomes selective acquisition, guided by structural relevance. Synthesis is no longer associative blending. It becomes model construction, guided by constraints. Integration is no longer an act of memorization. It becomes insertion of models into broader frameworks. Simulation is no longer imagination. It becomes predictive computation. Resilience is no longer emotional steadiness. It becomes architectural self-modification under uncertainty. Internally, this convergence is not dramatic. It does not produce a sudden shift in perception, identity, or ability. Instead, the changes are subtle and continuous. The individual notices that learning takes less effort. Retrieval requires less force. Patterns become more visible, and uncertainty becomes more informative than threatening. There is no sensation of acceleration. There is only reduction of friction. Tasks that once demanded conscious attention begin to execute automatically. Concepts that once felt isolated become interconnected. New information does not destabilize the system. It reorganizes it. Externally, convergence appears as performance that seems disproportionate to the visible input. The individual reads less but absorbs more. They observe briefly but infer deeply. They move slowly but reach conclusions quickly. To others, these behaviors resemble intuition. In reality, they are computation. The architecture is compressing data, running simulations, and retrieving structures that have already been integrated. The output is fast because the preparation happened earlier, at the architectural level. Convergence also alters the temporal shape of cognition. Before convergence, time is consumed by processing. Encoding must be followed by rehearsal, synthesis by repetition, integration by reinforcement. After convergence, time is not spent on maintaining content. It is spent on refining models and evaluating predictions. Learning shifts from acquiring information to improving architecture. When architecture improves, information becomes easier to process. This loop increases efficiency without adding strain. The mind is no longer occupied with content. It is occupied with structure. Internally, this shift changes the subjective meaning of knowledge. Knowledge is no longer valued for accumulation. It is valued for compression. A large database of facts becomes less useful than a small set of accurate models. The individual stops asking what they know and begins asking how the system is organized. This signals the arrival of architectural cognition. Architectural cognition does not compete on memory. It competes on structure. The mind that possesses better structure can produce better predictions with less data. This is the threshold at which performance begins to decouple from effort. Externally, convergence produces behavioral consistency. The individual becomes harder to provoke, harder to mislead, and harder to manipulate. They are not calm because of temperament. They are calm because the architecture provides internal redundancy. Single events do not modify their direction because predictions are not based on isolated inputs. Their cognition spans longer time horizons. Immediate stimuli have less influence because the architecture models consequences beyond the present moment. This is often misinterpreted as maturity. In reality, it is temporal extension and model stability. Convergence also affects error handling. Before convergence, errors cause confusion or withdrawal. After convergence, errors are processed as data. They reveal where the architecture is incomplete. This transforms failure from a setback into a diagnostic instrument. The individual begins to seek environments that produce high-quality feedback. They are not attracted to comfort, nor are they attracted to chaos. They are attracted to signal. Signal is information that reveals how a system behaves under variation. Systems that avoid signal cannot refine. Systems that engage signal evolve. Internally, convergence creates a new form of self-awareness. This awareness is not emotional and not narrative. It is architectural. The individual becomes aware of how they think, not just what they think. They can observe model formation, integration, and simulation as processes rather than as experiences. This meta-level awareness does not produce detachment. It produces precision. Decisions become less influenced by impulse and more influenced by model evaluation. This does not eliminate emotion, nor does it suppress it. Emotion becomes one variable among many. It is neither dominant nor dismissed. It is integrated. Externally, architectural self-awareness is difficult to detect. It does not manifest as abstraction or philosophical language. It manifests as clarity, stability, and strategic direction. The individual appears to know where they are going, even when the destination is not explicit. They do not depend on external validation, because validation does not modify the architecture. They do not seek permission, because permission does not change the model. They operate from internal structure, not external demand. At this stage, the distinction between learning, remembering, predicting, and adapting begins to dissolve. These are not separate functions. They are different expressions of the same architecture. The external observer sees intelligence. The internal system experiences efficiency. The individual does not feel smarter. They feel less obstructed. The reduction of cognitive friction is more important than any gain in capacity. High capacity with high friction produces inconsistency. Moderate capacity with low friction produces reliability. High capacity with low friction produces what is often called genius. Convergence closes the chapter on architectural foundation. Encoding has been reorganized, synthesis has been formalized, integration has been expanded, simulation has been activated, and resilience has been tested. The system is not complete. It is operational. A complete system is one that continues to modify itself. A rigid system cannot be complete because rigidity prevents adaptation. A fluid system cannot be complete because fluidity prevents structure. The optimal system is neither rigid nor fluid. It is structured but adaptive, stable but modifiable, predictive but curious. With convergence established, the architecture is ready for the next domain of development. The next domain is internal scaling. Internal scaling examines how architectural cognition expands beyond individual thought units into instinct, strategy, and identity. This is the transition point between structure and behavior. Structure without behavior is potential. Behavior without structure is noise. In the next chapter, the architecture begins to express itself externally, not through personality or performance, but through systematic direction.